In my own approach to preaching, I'm very influenced by the theology of Karl Rahner, and a big part of the effort in Rahnerian theology is to allow the Scriptures to illuminate human experience. It is an example of a from below type of preaching in which we begin in human experience and then try to see what illumination, help, encouragement the Christian tradition gives us in dealing with that particular human concern. And I've tried to boil this Rahnerian theology down into a four-step approach to dealing with the question of preaching and how we prepare our homilies, construct them, and actually deliver them. And in the first of those steps, it is a matter of discerning the problem that we find or the concern that is suggested by the Scripture readings and the needs of our community. And now in the second step, it is a matter of trying to describe vividly and accurately the various ways that the major concern, the topic of the homily, is experienced by the community. And this would actually constitute the first part of the actual homily, and it is an effort to draw as many people as possible into engagement with the topic that we're treating. Now, as we go through this stage, what we want people to be doing as they're listening to our homily is sort of sitting there nodding and saying something like, well, that's me he's talking about. Or I can certainly identify with that kind of problem. And so I think that what we're looking for here is accurate and vivid kinds of descriptions. I know I got part of my own sense of this whole business in reading Abraham Maslow when he used to talk to people about peak experiences. And he would tell them, did you ever have a peak experience? And he would say, well, it includes a sense of integration, peace, and so on. And many people would say, no, they didn't have one. But if he would get somebody up there who had a peak experience and would say that to the people, and describe it in their own poetic, colorful, vivid kind of language, then most people sitting there would be saying, oh, yeah, is that what you mean by a peak experience? Yeah, I've had one of those. So it's that kind of thing that I have in mind as I'm trying to pick up this whole idea of describing vividly and accurately the way the concern is experienced by the people. Now, clearly part of this is for us as preachers is to be good listeners, to be able to pick up the language that our people use. I think when we're at the parties, we should be listening to how they express themselves and how they give vent to their positive emotions. In our counseling, we should be picking up those phrases that people use to describe their deepest kinds of problems and the way they are struggling with things. So I think this business of being a good listener is crucial to this, and being able to reflect back to people the way they do experience the problems of life. Now, sometimes I think that can really be done in a very simple, direct, straightforward way, so that someone says, well, I was talking to a mother of 3 the other day who told me that she thinks that she has to pick up clothes once more, she's going to tear her hair out. Or if there's just one more meal that she has to prepare, she's going to be ready to resign and forfeit being Mother of the Year. There's a way in which we try to pick up the way the people would express the problem, and that we could actually say that directly. That the father of the family who says, one of my deep satisfactions in life really is just knowing that I'm doing the job, that I'm putting the bread on the table, and that I'm keeping the family together. And so my great moments are when I can just come home after work and talk with the kids and listen to what's going on with them in school. And, Father, that really makes me feel good. It feels like I'm worthwhile, that I'm a success in life when those kids are willing to come up and tell me about what's going on with them. It could be as direct as that, as just feeding back to the congregation the ways that people are actually experiencing the concerns of life. On the other hand, I think it could be a much more subtle thing. It could be a matter of just in the way we describe the problem, that people would know that somehow we have been in touch with it, that we have wrestled with it. That as we would be going through and talking about human relationships, we might be saying something like, well, It's really difficult in human relationships. We always want so much out of them, and we sometimes have high expectations of people, and yet there's always that disappointment. People aren't there when we really need them. They don't really hold us when we're ready to cry. We don't have someone to tell when we're really feeling good, and that's a hard thing to take in life. Well, maybe that when people are hearing us say that, they're sitting there saying, aha, he knows. Maybe it's not so direct of saying that I talked to a particular person who said that, but as we describe it, people would know that somehow we're in tune with that. And I think that brings out a third way, really, of going about it, to play off of that, and that is at times to just say how we feel the problem, or how we experience this concern, or how we are celebrating this particular joy. I think that very often that is an effective way of preaching. I was talking to a Protestant minister recently in a workshop on preaching who was telling me that he did a whole series of 6 sermons, that his congregation knew these were coming, all on personal witnesses to various aspects of the faith as he experienced it. And he said to me, never did he get such a strong feedback as he got from that series of 6. And the numbers in the congregation built up, and his mail was heavier, and so on. In other words, he was speaking very personally about his way of experiencing the problem. And that, again, becomes a stronger kind of thing. And I think that, indeed, that is a necessary thing to do at times, to speak personally, to let the people know that we're in the human situation. And at other times, I think that this more subtle method works better. I don't think that it doesn't seem good to me to make every week sort of a true confessions kind of thing, where the preacher is getting up talking about his own doubts, or his own trip to Jamaica, or his own experience with his own bishop or something. That becomes too personal, too churchy, I think. And what really is needed is to do that in a more subtle way. In other words, I think we're going to preach to a congregation over the long haul. We're going to do better if we can do a lot of that subtle approach. That is, to describe the problem in such a way that people really know that we're in tune with it. Now that brings up the whole need, of course, for us to be wrestling with the problems. You can't do that unless one really has engaged the questions personally. I think that's why it's important at the beginning of the week to understand what the concern is, to do our meditation on it as the week goes on, and to sense how we indeed respond to it and how the problem engages our own best efforts. Carl Jung once said that with the great questions, it's enough to have wrestled with them. Enough to have wrestled with them. In other words, we don't, with the great questions, have to have answers to everything. We don't have to come on to the congregation saying, I've got this all figured out and know exactly how we need to go about all of this, and let me just tell you about it. It's back to the empty vessel thing. We never want to talk to people as though we have it all together and they don't know, and we're going to fortunately communicate that to them. But it is enough to have wrestled with it, and I think that's what people really have to sense that we are doing. That indeed that the people know that we're in touch with the problem. I think of this, in terms of preaching at funerals, for example. How much damage is done when we would preach glibly at funerals or about any of the evils of the world. When we would talk about it as though it was all easy, as though we didn't know anything about grief or suffering, that we didn't understand how people had a sense of loss when a loved one no longer walked in their ranks. And to speak sweet nothings about resurrection and Easter Sunday and final fulfillment without any sense of cross and Good Friday and the struggles of life. I think we need to preach at those times as though we have wrestled with the question. Now, preachers who have lost a loved one ought to be able to do that effectively. In other words, we ought to be able to think back to our own experience, the way we try to encounter grief and manage it, and draw on that. I know, I guess I've always felt that I've preached more effectively about death or at funerals since my own father's death. That's precisely because I have that experience to draw on. But I think that people who don't, or preachers who have not yet experienced that kind of thing, could well learn it by being this good listener again. Instead of going to the funeral home and just quickly saying some comforting words, to be able to just be silent with the people and allow them to express a bit of what's going on with them would again give us this feel for this problem. So now I think about preaching about family life too, that's something that bugs people, that when we talk about family life in too idealistic terms, now those of us who are celibate clergy and doing the job of preaching have to be especially careful here, I think, because we can fall into the trap of idealizing that family life. I remember the one guy telling me about a sermon he heard about family life, and the priest was talking glowingly about it and the model of the Holy Family and so on. And the guy said to me, you ought to come and live in my house for a while and take care of my 3 kids and have to interact with my wife when she's going through that time of the month. Well, that's an interesting kind of comment. In other words, he was bringing it down to the realities. And I think that we lose the congregation if we would talk glibly about such things or idealistically or be out of tune with reality. Again, the thing that we really want is, as the people are listening to us go through all of this, that as we're actually in the sermon now describing the human concern that we've picked as the topic of the week, in dialogue with the community and the Scriptures, that people would be sitting there saying, he knows. He understands what life is about. He obviously has experienced this in some way. Maybe we don't get up and say, well, I really have this particular problem of faith, but the people would know that somehow we understand their struggle with the doubts that might occur to them as they go through tough economic times and so on. So, one of the main things here is to have wrestled with the questions. Now, when we haven't done that naturally, then we ought to work at it. And I think we ought to be ready to admit when we haven't. In other words, when we're really drawing on other people's experience, maybe that ought to come out. Maybe we ought to be willing to say it. Or I think, first of all, maybe admit it to ourselves. Know that we don't have a direct experience of being married, for example, as celibate clergy. We shouldn't pretend as though we do have all the answers in that area. What we really draw on, I think, in that case is our counseling of married people. And we admit to ourselves that we have a second-hand kind of experience there, and that comes across in our preaching. I think people are very willing to accept that. They don't expect us to have an insider knowledge of what it means to interact with a spouse. But they do expect us to have an appreciation of the fact that they are struggling with it and be able to pick up the language and words that they use in trying to handle all of that. Now, we need some guides in how to do this well, and I turn now to the world of modern phenomenology. Now that brings up a whole philosophical world that maybe some people are not familiar with. It's the names of Husserl and Heidegger and Paul Ricoeur especially that come to my mind here. And by phenomenology I mean the whole attempt in modern philosophy to describe the human situation well and to sort of bracket the truth as we do it. To just begin to describe how life is experienced. Now, I can discern in following authors like Langdon Gilkey and Naming the Whirlwind, which are very helpful on this, at least 3 different types of phenomenology that we really ought to deal with. The philosopher Husserl talked a lot about intentionality. He described our conscious life, our drive for something more. And I think that if we would take that type of phenomenology seriously, we would think a lot about the dynamics of our own spiritual life. Part of our description, for example, when we're speaking about love might be our drive for the perfect lover. That we have this sort of innate longing to find a person who will be totally present to us, who will fulfill all of our needs, will hold us when we're sad and rejoice with us when things are going well. That's part of our intentionality, our drive in life for this perfect lover. And that when we begin to look at that drive, of course, and if we can describe that well, then that's going to raise for us the religious question. It throws us back on our own limits and suggests to us that is there indeed any final fulfillment for that longing? It raises the question of whether life is really absurd or meaningful. Are we a useless passion, or in some ways will our deepest longings ever be fulfilled? So that would be an example of taking Husserl's idea of intentionality. of what our conscious life is tending us towards, and trying to use it as a way of describing the human situation. And so what we're hoping is that people could fill in on that. We could do that with a whole bunch of ideas, trying to be in touch again with our own conscious life. Meditation really helps with this, to see what's going on with us. You could also do the analysis in terms of our knowing, that we desire to know more. We learn a certain thing and we find out we want to know more. There's a certain drive to understand that's inside of us, and that never seems to be satisfied with any particular thing that we know. Again, this is very valuable because it keeps suggesting that there's an infinite horizon towards which we're going, that there's an absolute truth that we're trying to get in touch with, and it raises the question of whether that will ever happen or not. So Husserl's phenomenology of intentionality, while the language is vague as he gives it to us, really is very down-to-earth and concrete. We're describing our conscious life. Some people might put it in terms of, well, I always have this vague feeling that I'm unworthy, that I don't measure up somehow, that I'm walking around feeling vaguely guilty, and that people are looking at me as not meeting my duties, or I'm dripping in guilt some way. Again, to be able to describe that to people in a concrete and vivid way perhaps draws people in. They're saying, aha, that's me. That's exactly right. I am walking around feeling vaguely inadequate all the time, and I now have to know something what to do about it. And then if we catch people like that, then when we get to the part of what the Scriptures have to say, they're listening because they know there's something here that they have to hear. Let's look at the philosopher Martin Heidegger now, the 20th century existentialist philosopher, Being and Time. Some people know his work through that. A very difficult thinker, and whether we know his work or not, he is so valuable to us as describing, in his terms, our being in the world. In other words, Heidegger saw that a good phenomenology wasn't just describing our interior conscious states, but the way we actually live in an affective and total person way in our world. He liked to talk about the fact that we are thrown into existence, that we find ourselves enmeshed in this network of things. He's the one that talked to us about that we are beings moving towards death. The death sets the boundary for our existence. He talked about the way that we needed to be resolute in life if we're going to work effectively. So what this phenomenology would do now is to suggest to us other ways of describing the human situation that would be much more rooted in the world as we know it. We'd maybe be talking here about what it meant to be a citizen of the United States, to grow up in a country where we have known freedom, and where a lot of our problem is that we have many alternatives in life. We could talk a lot about freedom in this regard, what some have called the supermarket situation. Our being in the world as middle-class people means that we have a lot of options in life, that we're walking through the supermarket where we can choose different lifestyles. That's a way for parents to understand what their young people are going through, that they have a lot of live alternatives now. They can choose to become a Hindu or take up transcendental meditation or take up an atheistic option in life. Part of our being in the world as Americans is to sense the many options that we have. Part of this would be to be very much in touch with the affective side of the way we live in the world. How do we feel when we are condemned to be free? What's it like to wander through that supermarket of options and to feel that, geez, I don't know if I can choose or not, to feel the anxiety of having too many choices? On the other hand, when we're preaching to minority groups and people living in ghettos and so on, then we have to be in touch with the fact that they don't have options. What's it feel like to be imprisoned in a ghetto, in that hellish circle of poverty, you have no way out, and so on. So Heidegger's phenomenology would put us in another direction here, where we would be describing our being in the world. And that would, of course, include very much our relationships, our interdependencies. Be a great way of describing what does it mean to live in a family, of being close together, of having drains on our time, responsibilities. What does it mean to have the mother taking the kids off to running them to Boy Scouts and out to the soccer field, and always feeling like a taxi driver and so on. That's her being in the world, and something that we might want to tap. Now let me look at a third type of phenomenology, borrowed from Paul Ricoeur here, who reminds us of the importance of symbols in our life, the way myth and symbol shapes our self-interpretation. His idea, and is picked up by others, is that we ingest the symbols of the culture. We bring them into our consciousness, and they become the ways then we look at our world. They shape our perception of things. They determine what we notice and what we don't see about things. And it's important to be in touch with the symbols that really are important in our American culture, and to be able to draw on those. I know one that seems effective to me is the Marlboro Man. I often talk about the times that I was working in a warehouse and piling up these big cartons of Luckies, about 50 Luckies to every one Marlboro. And what did Marlboro do? They put a man on the horse, gave him a tattoo, put him out in the middle of a plain. Before long, I was piling up more Marlboros than I was Luckies. It was one of the most successful ad campaigns in history, I guess. And what it did was to give us a symbol for something that is in the American psyche. The Marlboro Man became the symbol of autonomous freedom, of a man who had no ties. It appealed to people who wanted to be macho. It talked to us about a whole notion of freedom that was apart from human community, where the free person was the one who really had no responsibilities to anybody else, that could ride off into the sunset whenever they felt like it. So the symbol of the Marlboro Man catches, therefore, something about the way we experience freedom in our own country, about what our own ideals of freedom are. Now, to be able to talk about the Marlboro Man then captures a lot of other images for people. They walk out, the Marlboro Man catches in the mind. The value of symbols and images really is that it will pull together ideas. It provides a focal point around which many feelings and insights can collect. Surely part of the art of the preacher is to come up with these very good symbols. I often feel that's the weakest part of my own preaching, and that what we've got to do is to read more poetry, to become more imaginative in the way we go about our preaching, so that we get these striking images. Of course, out of our Christian tradition, you have the image of the kingdom, for example, that is supposed to collect a lot of these ideas. So the third type of phenomenology really is the symbolic side, to be able to describe the human situation in symbolic terms so that people carry that home with them, or so that it gathers a lot of particular thoughts for them. Now, in doing our whole phenomenology, storytelling is very important. We have a whole thing about narrative theology these days. Narrative theology has brought to our minds the importance of the story. The Bible uses stories in order to teach its lessons. Marvelous is to hear that story of the Exodus with all of its sharp, vivid detail. That's what sticks in people's minds, and that's what helps them to shape their religious consciousness. We think of Jesus, what a marvelous storyteller he was, and how he took the ordinary things of life and wove his stories around them. So it seems important to use stories in our homilies, not just as a way of making a moral point, but of doing a good phenomenology so that it draws people in. And I think it's important to get the right kinds of stories in all of this. The model I have of not the way to do it are the people who come on the Johnny Carson show and talk about their jet-set existence, about flying around here to there and meeting important people and all that. I don't think that those are the kind of stories we need in our homily, because they're elitist, because they're out of tune with what the people are feeling. We don't need a lot of churchy stories. You don't need preachers getting up talking about what the internal workings of the church, or about their own interactions with other clergy, or about their interactions with bishops, or stories of popes and so on. I think what we need is much more the model of Jesus Christ in this, the one who told stories out of the secular material, who talked about birds of the air and the lilies of the field, and a man getting beat up and laying on a road and so on, and a father dealing with a son who takes off with his inheritance. Those are the kinds of stories that I think we need, that reflect the human situation. They become a very good way of doing our phenomenology because they have an emotional content to them, because an imaginative element comes out. And whenever we begin to say, now I have a story to tell you, to begin the homily with a story immediately draws people in. I know a lot of times in giving just talks in general, I think to begin with a story that possesses these common human elements, that brings out the struggle of life and the deepest concerns, is really an effective way of going about the whole thing. Now, I think in doing the homily, what we often need to do is to say in very many ways how people would really end up experiencing the problem. For example, if we're going to talk about social justice matters, and we got the problem now of a failure to respond to it adequately. That's the problem. We want to talk about social justice. People aren't doing anything. So why is that? So maybe we tick off a series of reasons. So someone says, I've got my own problems and can't be worried about all those poor people. Or the sufferings of the poor are too great to face. If I try to face all of that starvation in the world, it just tears me up. Another person says, well, what can I do in the face of this tremendous poverty in our world? I'm one person. I'm inadequate. What could I possibly do? Another person says, I don't have much and can't contribute anything. I don't have much myself. What could I possibly, how can I help anyone else? Someone else says, I've tried to help, but nothing seems to improve the situation. I've been working at it, and the world is still a mess as it was before. And then maybe at that point, after giving a whole series of things, we could even in the homily pause and allow people to think about that and saying, well, where is my problem? Why is it that I'm not involved? And of course, what we're hoping again is that people are picking up on one or the other of those particular ideas there. Let me try to bring out another way in which I think we talk about the problem. People have various ways of hearing things or responding, and be hard to just describe all this, but the words feel, hear, and see are going to appeal to different people. In other words, some people tend to hear things, other people tend to see, and other people tend to feel. And so in part of my phenomenology would be to try to get that in there. So we're talking about the love of God, so we might say to people, well, what we've got to be able to do is to see that God loves us. We have to hear a word of care in our own experience. We have to be able to feel deep in our heart that there is the gracious one who surrounds us with his love. Now, in doing that, what I'm trying to do is to catch a lot of different people in that. What I'm trying to do is that some people out there, when you use the word feel, are vibrating with you. Other people, when you use the word see, and other people the word hear. That's the key word that they would be latching on to. You're hoping, again, to draw in more and more people. I think, finally, one other thing to keep in mind is the whole male-female difference that we have in our culture. That the male language is different from the language that women use. And maybe the primary concerns are different. We might be able to say that men really are feeling the need to be successful in life and are fearing failure, while women are feeling strongly the need for networking, for community, for relationships, and are fearing being alone. So when we do our phenomenology, it seems to me we would want to include both male and female type experiences in the United States. So we're talking about pride. Maybe that is a key problem for men. But we don't want to give a whole sermon on pride and make everyone feel as though they should not be self-actualizing. Maybe the key problem for women is that they're not achievement-oriented enough, or that they're too self-sacrificing and really aren't doing enough to improve themselves. Not enough pride in who they are. But anyway, that can be thrown out, and the people who need it can latch onto it. So the second step in this whole problem of doing a homily is to describe the concern that we've picked in vivid, colorful ways. And we're doing it keeping in mind male-female differences, keeping in mind the way people perceive things, trying to do a phenomenology that touches our consciousness, our ways of living in the world, the kind of symbols and so on. We're trying to reflect our own struggles with the whole business as we go along, and all for the purpose of drawing people into the topic of the homily so they're saying, that's me, and now I've got to listen to what you have to say in response. I want to now turn to the third step in this four-step approach to preparing and organizing a homily. In the first step, it was a matter of discerning the common human concern that we find in our community and as reflected in the scripture readings for a given weekend. And then secondly, we tried to describe this concern, to suggest many ways in which the preacher might vividly try to speak about this human concern so that people will be interested and be listening. And now in this third step, it is a matter of making use of the valid and helpful responses to the major concerns which are available in the culture, in secular sources, in the sciences, other religious traditions, and so on. Now, there's an interesting chapter or section in a book entitled Fulfilled in Your Hearing, the Homily in the Sunday Assembly. It really is an excellent little booklet put out by the Bishops' Committee on Priestly Life and Ministry. Just came out in 1982, entitled again, Fulfilled in Your Hearing. It has a lot of wonderful ideas on preaching. It is quite a fine document. And in one of those sections in here, I noticed the phrase, the preacher as mediator of meaning. And it says at one point that the preacher is called upon to point to the signs of God's presence in the lives of his people, so that in joyous recognition of that presence, they may join in proclaiming God's glory. Now, I want to use that as a basis here for making this third point, that idea that the priest is a mediator of meaning, or the preacher has that task. And that is that there are meanings in the culture as a whole, that God's Spirit is at work in the whole world, that means that there are valid insights into the divine-human relationship that percolate up in the culture and that one can make use of. Now here it's important to work out an adequate theology. Now in the theology of Paul Tillich and his method of correlation, his idea was that the culture produces for us questions and problems, and the Christian revelation produces answers to that. And I think many preachers use that sort of method of correlation, maybe not linking it explicitly with Tillich, but they make use of that in their preaching. Now, what I would like to suggest here is another theology, strongly influenced by Karl Rahner, that says that the world in which we live, the culture as a whole, produces not just questions, but insights as well. And here the notion again is that all of us live and move and swim in one graced world, that God's universal revelation given to all people is the catalyst for people coming to a saving faith and the production of valid insights into who God is. It suggests to us that God's truth is bubbling up all over our world. It tells us that the culture produces not just questions, but at least partial answers as well. It puts us on alert to find truth in other religious traditions. That seems to be an important part of all this. I like to tell the story of the Buddha that way. You know, the Buddha he was a young man and encountered pain and a person who was sick and a person who died, and he wrestled with that. He left his wife and his young son, went out into the forest, and out in the forest he thought about this problem. What did it mean? Meditated on it. He encountered other wise men and asked them about it. And finally, after 7 years of this kind of struggle, he sat down under the Bodhi tree and had this great moment of enlightenment where he understood something about this problem of life. He wrestled with whether he should tell people about it. As the story goes, he was walking to Benares with his friends, and he decided to tell them and preach to them the great sermon on the Four Noble Truths, that life is indeed pain, and that the source of the pain in life is craving, that the solution to life's problems is to get over the craving. And then he taught them the Eightfold Path on how to accomplish that. Well, that story reminds us of course, I'm talking about Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the Tathagata, the Enlightened One, the founder of the great Buddhist religious tradition. Now, when you tell the story in that way, it's meant to be a reminder that Buddhism isn't just a pagan religion. It isn't just a false kind of thing made up by a human being, but our perception would be that the Buddha was struggling with the life problem and that his moment of satori or enlightenment amounted to understanding something that's true and good and beautiful about the human situation. In other words, from the Ranierian perspective, we have here a moment of grace. We have the workings of the Spirit. We have a universal revelation that is reaching some sort of objectification here. It's reaching an expression that tells us something that is really valuable about what human existence is all about. Now, from a Christian perspective, we want to critique that. And we're not going to say that it's a total insight, and we don't want to put the Buddha on a par with Jesus. But we have no problem with saying in this theology that the Buddha is really a prophet, and that he has correctly interpreted the call of God and the existence of grace in the world in some ways. It might be partial, it might be incomplete, it might need revision, we might have to critique it from our vantage point of our Christian scriptures and so on, but there is a validity about it. And I think what we would do then is extend this whole analysis to all of the world's great religious traditions, to Hinduism, to the great Chinese philosophies of Confucius and Lao Tzu, to the Judaic tradition, to Mohammedanism, to all of the world's great religious traditions. So, and also, there's no reason why we can't see that same thing happening in the world of philosophy, in the world of science, among Marxists, among all the people who are interested in bettering our world. Not that it's produced a tradition, but we can well say that the people have understood something true and valuable about God and about us and about that relationship. And that becomes the real basis for this third point that says make use of valid and helpful responses to the major concerns which are available, the responses that are available in the culture, secular sources, sciences, religious traditions, and so on. And that's one reason for thinking of the preacher as a mediator of meanings. We ought to be able to be in touch with those meanings we find in the culture and be able to use them, I think, effectively in our preaching and in trying to relate, to find some answers to the problems we've raised in the first part of the homily. This really suggests the need for a whole discipline that we might call practical theology. Practical theology would be an attempt to analyze the culture in terms of our Christian interests. It would be the kind of thing that we might find, for example, in the work of Gregory Baum, who has studied sociology and investigated what people like Weber and Durkheim have said, and have tried to use those insights in helping us to understand the world in which we live. That seems to me to be a most valuable kind of thing to do. Andrew Greeley has used a lot of empirical research, and working within his own role as a sociologist has brought to light things in the culture that would be most valuable for us to know and understand. And I'm sure, Rosemary Ruther would do that kind of thing in her own work, trying to see the culture from the viewpoint of women's perspective. And that could go on and on. Black theology, James Cone and his attempt to do that kind of thing. Liberation theology, often helping us to see things from the vantage point of the dispossessed and the marginalized in our society. But I'm afraid that we really need a lot more of this to go on. We would need more work with the ethnic traditions, although here I would point to Michael Novak's work in his book, The Rise of the Unmeltable Ethnics, which helped to give us some insight into the particular way in which American ethnics experience life in this country of ours. The need is to be in touch with the culture, to find out what modern songs are telling us. As I say that, I think of a friend of mine who does a marvelous job of, as a radio program here in our area. He plays some of the modern songs and discusses those songs. They look for themes that they find in there. And very often the young people, it's a way of access to the young people's lives. That would be another way of trying to do the same kind of thing, to be in touch with the culture. I think of another source here, David Tracy's book, The Analogical Imagination, which is very difficult reading indeed, but there is a chapter in there which tries to do this, that is, analyze our culture, especially from the viewpoint of what it would mean to us in our interests as Christian people or as preachers. But my major sense is that this discipline is very underdeveloped and that we need a whole lot more work so that we can know what's going on in our world and be able to respond to that. Now, as we would begin to perhaps try to make this more concrete, or to say, give some examples perhaps of how we might go about this, a really fine example right now is drawing on the insights of Mohandas K. Gandhi. Now, because the movie Gandhi has been shown and that many people have seen it, there's a lot of interest in Gandhi, articles in the paper and so on. And we could really draw on a lot of his ideas in making response to particular concerns that we find in our culture. Let me give one example of that. As we look at our culture, surely one of our problems is the success ethic, that we have this competition going on. Here we've got competition now recently reported of getting kids into the right nursery school. If you don't get kids into the right nursery school, they're never going to make it in life somehow. It's a problem that was detailed in the news in New York City. We've got this whole idea of climbing up the economic ladder, of making it a success. That's the way we measure our worth, by how much money we make and how many goods we collect and so on. So it's clear we've got a success ethic. We put that burden on our kids. It's a problem with the Little League as we try to go with that. They've got to win at all costs, got to be number one, all of that kind of thing. Now, if we're preaching on that, we clearly have Christian answers to all of that. Our scriptures tell us all kinds of important things about the importance of being rather than having, about more important things in life than amassing money and so on, and we can draw on that. But there's no reason why at this time we can't draw on the insights of Gandhi to help us with that. Gandhi had that marvelous thing that he got from the Bhagavad Gita, his own key Hindu scriptures, where he talked about Arjuna. And the problem of Arjuna was whether he should fight, and the problem was there that he was fighting his relatives, so that if he won the battle, he'd feel bad because he killed his relatives, and if he withdrew, he would be a coward and so on, and not have acted as he should have. And fortunately, his charioteer was Krishna, and Krishna comes along and tells Arjuna that he must fight. He can't withdraw. He must fight, but he should fight without excessive worry about whether he wins or loses. And Gandhi reinterprets that scripture passage out of the Bhagavad Gita to indicate what he thinks is the matchless remedy for the problem of life. That is, to renounce the fruits of action. That the key thing in life is to be able to act well, to meet our responsibilities, to make plans properly, but to do so without getting hung up on success or failure. Now, it seems to me that today, with all the interest in Gandhi, there would be no reason at all why we couldn't use that story, why we couldn't use his example of being able to liberate 350 million people out of that particular biblical scriptural insight, I should say, out of his own sacred scriptures. You could take as well other things from Gandhi's life, his whole renouncing of violence, the Satyagraha campaign, the Truth Force campaign that is so impressed in people's minds who saw the movie. And here they are seeing the effectiveness of nonviolent approaches, confronting the oppressor with the truth of the situation so that both the oppressed and the oppressor can move towards a greater humanity, a more fulfilled kind of existence. So that the oppressor in this case would simply walk out of the country because one would see that it had been confronted with this nonviolent approach. Well, why couldn't that be used again as a valid insight out of the 20th century reinterpretation of the Hindu scriptures? And because of the interest in it, I think we could draw on it. I know one priest who has preached effectively on making use of ideas from that movie. So there we have one example maybe of how that can be done. That's an example of using another religious tradition. Let's do that same thing with other ones. I think of another Buddhist story. That let's imagine we've got a homily in which we're dealing with the fact of trying to face up to the dark side of life, and that the great human problem is to escape from that. We escape in so many ways. That's what sin really is, to escape from reality. And we can use work as escape, drugs, drink, everything else. And part of the escape is not to really face the question of death, of our ultimate limitations in life. Well, there's a story out of the Buddhist tradition that might well be told there. The Buddha tells this story of a woman who came to him and her little boy had died, and she's carrying the little boy, and she won't admit that the boy has died, and she wants the Buddha to revive him or help him get over this sleep or sickness that he's in. And so the Buddha says, okay, fine, I'll tell you what you do. We need to feed him something, and in order to feed him, you have to go get the ingredients from various houses. But you can only, here's the trick, you can only get the ingredients from the house of people that have had no suffering. So the woman starts out throughout the village. She stops, asks for the ingredients, says, well, have you had any suffering? They said, well, yeah, we've had a death. Goes on like that. She meets each house, never gets the ingredient. She comes back to the Buddha and says, I'm ready to bury my dead son. Well, I think it's a marvelous story, and it helps to teach us something out of the Buddhist tradition. Again, I wouldn't see any problem with using that kind of story, just as I might throw in the line that is attributed to the Buddha in our activist culture, don't just do something, stand there. Sort of a striking way of saying that there might be another value system that might be at work here. No reason why we can't draw on the Hindu tradition of meditation and bring that out to people. I think that when we're looking at the Jewish tradition, we think of the movie Fiddler on the Roof, or the play that so many people saw, and we find there the fiddler being able to talk to God about anything, about family life, about money, about every aspect of what he's feeling and thinking. And we think about the great Jewish contribution that they see God in the whole of their life and everything that's going on. And the great sense of family life that grows out of that, and the idea of having liturgy within the family situation. All of that would seem to me to be a valid insight that we could indeed draw on as we would go along and trying to respond to particular problems. Maybe people are looking only for the extraordinary meeting with God and aren't able to find it within their ordinary life. We could even take Marxism, which turns so many people off, and surely we don't want to get up in the pulpit, well, I don't think anyway, and say, you know, I got this idea from a communist, because most of our people are going to get turned off by that. But as a matter of fact, there are certain things in Marxism and his thought that really could be used. For example, his whole idea of ideology, that we use a rationalized structure argument in order to buttress unfair, unjust structures. We could look at it could help us to look at ideology as we find it right within our own church. We could use it as a basis for understanding bias against women, for example, or anti-Semitism that creeps into Christian understandings of things. We could use the whole Marxist interest in social justice and the fact that they are trying to create this classless society. We could make use out of their interest in social justice, at least, to help us see things more clearly. Let's think about the whole idea of what the psychologists tell us. I find a lot of insight there. Take the humanistic psychologists like Abraham Maslow as a good example, or Carl Rogers. All of that talk of self-actualization, that we need to fulfill ourselves. That's a value we find in the culture. There's many people into that they have this sense that they must develop their talent, that there's latent potential in them that they have to get going and get in gear on. We find many women in the culture who are saying, I've been too passive dependent and I have to now take charge of my life, get hold of things. I must actualize some of my own potential. Well, that's going on. It's on all the talk shows. We hear people, it's in the air. And I think there's a valid insight there. I mean, it really is true from our Christian perspective that we've got more talent than we use. God's given us gifts and we ought to maximize them. It's true that there's no person in the culture who's supposed to just be passive dependent, that we all have something to contribute. Again, my idea here is, why couldn't we latch on to that? Now, why can't we make use of that particular kind of idea, the self-actualization idea, self-fulfillment, as in order to help people to realize that by their fruits we are known, by that we have to produce in life, that God has given us so many gifts. And again, when we talk like that, the hope is that because the meaning's already in the culture, that it really will speak to people, that they'll be able to say, aha, yes, that's something that is true. At the same time, we have to critique it and saying that there are all these positive points in these in the culture. We remain in judgment upon it. As I'm sitting there preparing my sermon, I have to be saying, well, is that valid or not? And with this self-actualizing ideal, I got to keep in mind that there's a great danger to get into a thing of, well, pull my own strings and do my own thing and take care of number one, and I'm going to develop my talent and potential the way I want to without concern for the community or my own family. So that critique has to be built into it as well. But in my mind, that doesn't vitiate the positive meaning that we find in the culture here. I think of other things that we get from psychology, the whole developmental structure here, the adult life cycle thing. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas there that would help us to people to deal with the midlife crisis in life, to see how that we must grow as an adult, how we have to move ahead in our understanding of the faith, how a greater engagement in the world would be part of reaching greater maturity, and so on. I think that many of the life cycle things are slanted, and you take Kohlberg's stages of development that so many people draw on, I think really needs to be critiqued from many vantage points, especially from the women's viewpoint, as Carol Gilligan has done so well in her book In a Different Voice. But at least I think there's something there that we could draw on. Gail Sheehy's passages that so many people could identify with in the culture, we can go with that and to pick out ideas there that may well make sense to us. So we're drawing on these various disciplines. I thought of another one out of the general field of psychology, and that's Carl Jung. Now, Carl Jung has great ideas about the fact that after the age of 35 that almost all problems of human beings have to do with meaning. Well, that's what we're in the business of, meaning. That helps for people to know that the psychological tradition sees that as a problem, that not all people are into Freudianism where the main problem is sex, that there's also seen that the problem of meaning is present. That seems good thing to keep in mind here and to draw on. I think of something else Jung said. He once said, talked about the great importance of the doctrine of the Assumption in the 20th century as one of the great statements made in the 20th century. Mostly because it helped us understand the feminine element that should be involved in human existence and would help men get in touch with the feminine pole. But when I preach on the Assumption, because it seems like such an abstruse doctrine and people are wondering what could that possibly mean, I think there's great credibility in saying that Carl Jung, who's hardly, who isn't a Catholic and isn't really a very orthodox type Christian, tells us that this assumption is so important. I like to use that in order to gain credibility. About that the assumption is telling us something important. I think it tells us something important about bodiliness, about the goodness of sexuality and so on. But that would be a way to preach on the assumption where we would be drawing in here an insight from another source. I think about American literature and how important that would be. I know I teach a course on the problem of evil in 20th century American fiction. And I find that to be very helpful to me, to read people like Saul Bellow and John Cheever and John Updike and James Baldwin and Joyce Carol Oates, people like that who have a feel for the human situation. I think the artists very often are the people who have their antennae out. They know what's going on in the culture. And so to get a feel for what is there and possible insights, I think reading that contemporary fiction would be most helpful, so that maybe we get from James Baldwin a sense of what the blacks can contribute to the overall sense of what it means to be a human being and to be a good citizen in this country of ours. There may well be important insights that he has that we could draw on. So the fiction, as I see it, provides us very often with a lot of sense of the problem, and they help us to know the human concern, and I think perhaps it's most effective that way. But periodically, it seems to me, in that fiction, we find something important. I think maybe F. Scott Fitzgerald's critique in The Great Gatsby of the dream, of getting carried away with the past and being excessively nostalgic, could well be something that we still need to hear as Americans, to be in touch with the present moment and not think about the past as being idyllic or somehow perfect, or that we could repeat it or resurrect it, as that great line that Gatsby uses in that particular book. So, let me take one other area that comes to my mind, that is the existentialist philosophy that's in the air. I find a lot of help from someone even like Sartre, who is an atheist, who talks about the fact that we are condemned to be free, that we carry the burden of freedom upon our shoulders. And that seems to me to be a striking idea. Rahner has picked it up in his own theology, and it's true just exactly the way people are feeling these days. Freedom is a burden. I got to make choices. I'm responsible for myself. I can't put it off on anybody else. That really seems to me to be a powerful notion that we can use. We are condemned to be free. We can't get away from it. Sartre's right about that. And I don't see any reason why we can't use his language in order to make that point to our people. So, in the other area I'm thinking about is our common American experience, the American dream, the wisdom that's collected in our culture. I think about such a simple thing as saying that actions speak louder than words. We're a pragmatic people. We want to know if it works or not, and words aren't enough. And we've got a lot of sayings, some of them a bit vulgar, that make that point, but that phrase, actions speak louder than words, is really a good one. And that connects so much with our gospel message, by their fruits you will know them. And it would be simple, it seems to me, to use that kind of idea in our preaching. And then I come to Martin Luther King, who seems to me to be such a fine example of this. I was privileged to preach in a black church not long ago, and I read a lot of Martin Luther King's sermons in preparation for that, and I'm so impressed with what he was able to do. But part of what he did was draw on the American experience. He kept insisting on the American dream, on the values of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, and saying that indeed there are ideals there that could galvanize our efforts to help spread the kingdom in our world. That is a marvelous dream, that all people are equal, and that we are created by God, have responsibilities, that we need to produce freedom and make it available for everyone in our country. He used that so effectively to bring together so many people, and I believe that we can draw on that as well. There are beautiful, powerful statements in our tradition as an American culture that we can make use of, it seems to me, in our preaching. And I think that maybe a final one, I mentioned Carol Gilligan before, In a Different Voice, and one of the things that I get out of her marvelous book is the way that women's experience has to be respected in our culture, and that the way women do have a distinctive and different voice. You have to be very careful of saying God came to save all men, for example, of cleaning up our sexist language. That would be something that we're learning from the feminist movement in our culture today, and I think that we could well keep in mind and would improve our preaching, to be very careful about avoiding offensive language and patriarchal categories, and listening to that different voice that is in our culture. And so here in this third step, what I've tried to do is to say that there are valid ideas that are available to us in our society, in the world in which we live. They're there because God's Spirit is at work in the whole world. They're not just man-made. They're not just a mere humanism. They're the product of grace, of God's universal revelation and human beings' response to that. And we must seize on that. Now, I don't mean that it just is always just saying it directly. Well, the American culture says this, therefore let's do it. I think very often it is much more subtle than that. We might not even say it directly in the homily, but we weave it in. It becomes part of our general approach because we're open to the meanings we find there. So the preacher really is a mediator of the meanings found in the culture. We're trying to get hold of them, critique them in the light of the gospel, and make use of them as we try to respond to the concern that we're addressing in the homily.